Roses in the Rugged West by Simon Cross. The stagecoach rattled along the uneven trail, jostling its passengers with each bump and hole. Among them sat Miss Catherine Everett, her gloved hands clutching the worn leather seat beneath her. She had never imagined herself traveling to a small town called Willow Springs in the Western Territories, yet here she was, embarking on what her father had termed a necessary adventure. Catherine brushed a strand of chestnut hair from her face and gazed out the window at the vast landscape. The rolling hills stretched endlessly before her, dotted with scrubby vegetation, and the occasional cluster of trees. It was beautiful in its own way, wild and untouched, so different from the manicured gardens and crowded streets of Boston. "First time out west, miss?" The elderly woman beside her smiled kindly, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of years under the open sky. "Is it that obvious?" Catherine asked, smoothing her travel-worn dress. "The way you're taking it all in?" The woman nodded. "Like you're seeing the face of God himself in those hills." Perhaps she was. After the devastating loss of her mother and the subsequent financial troubles that had befallen her father's shipping business, Catherine had felt adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The teaching position in Willow Springs represented not just employment but escape. The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing Catherine against the side. Outside, the driver shouted and the horses whinnied in distress. "Who there? Easy, boys." The driver's voice carried over the sudden commotion. Catherine peered out the window to see a rider approaching alongside the coach, his horse keeping pace with remarkable ease. The man wore a dark hat pulled low over his eyes, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the determination in his posture. "Stage has got to stop," the rider called out. "Bridge ahead is damaged from the storm." The driver pulled the team to a halt, and the passengers murmured with concern. Catherine felt a flutter of apprehension as the rider dismounted and approached the coach. When he stepped into view at the door, she was struck by the intensity of his gaze, deep blue eyes that seemed to take her measure in an instant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair. "Name's Jackson Reed. I'm the Marshal of Willow Springs. The bridge over Mason Creek took damage in last night's storm. Not safe to cross with a full coach. I'll need to escort you folks on a detour that'll add about 3 hours to your journey." Collective groans filled the coach, but Catherine found herself studying the Marshal with interest. There was something compelling about him, an air of quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. "We don't have much choice," the driver called down, "unless anyone fancies a swim with their horses." Marshal Reed's eyes met Catherine's briefly, and she felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging something unspoken between them, then replaced his hat. "We'll stop at Widow Cooper's place to rest the horses and get some refreshment before taking the long way round," he announced. "Should be there in about 20 minutes." As the journey resumed with Marshal Reed riding alongside, Catherine found herself watching him through the window. There was a grace to his horsemanship, a oneness with the animal that spoke of years in the saddle. When they arrived at the modest homestead, he was there to assist the passengers down from the coach. "Miss," he said simply, offering his hand to Catherine. She took it, feeling the strength and calluses that testified to a life of labor. "Thank you, Marshal. I'm Catherine Everett, the new schoolteacher for Willow Springs." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Miss Everett, the town's been looking forward to your arrival?" "Have they?" She stepped down, momentarily unsteady after the long journey. His hand at her elbow steadied her, the touch brief but reassuring. 6 months without a proper teacher has left folks desperate for education," he explained. "Though I admit we expected someone," he hesitated. "Older," Catherine supplied with a smile. At 22, she was young for a schoolteacher, particularly one traveling alone to the territories. "More weathered," he corrected, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "The West has a way of aging people before their time." The Widow Cooper emerged from her home, a sturdy, compact woman with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Catherine of her late mother. "Bring those travelers in, Jackson. I've got coffee boiling and biscuits fresh from the oven." Inside the surprisingly cozy home, Catherine found herself seated beside Marshal Reed at a large wooden table. The other passengers chatted among themselves, grateful for the respite from travel. But Catherine was aware of the Marshal's presence beside her with an acuteness that was both puzzling and exhilarating. "Have you been in Willow Springs long, Marshal Reed?" she asked, accepting a cup of rich, dark coffee from Widow Cooper. Born and raised, he replied. Left for a spell during the war, came back and took up the badge when the previous marshal retired. And is the town safe? She hadn't wanted to ask, but her father's warnings about the wild territories had planted seeds of concern. Marshal Reed considered her, those penetrating blue eyes seeming to see beyond her polite inquiry to the fear beneath. It's as safe as anywhere, Miss Everett. We have our share of troubles, mostly cowboys celebrating too hard after a cattle drive or the occasional dispute over property lines. Nothing a sensible woman like yourself couldn't handle with common sense. There was something in his tone, respect, perhaps, that bolstered Catherine's confidence. I'm glad to hear it. I confess, my father painted rather a bleak picture of frontier life. Many Easterners do, he replied, breaking a biscuit in half. Steam rose from its center as he offered her a portion. They imagine us all to be uncouth savages, drinking whiskey for breakfast and settling arguments with six-shooters. Catherine accepted the biscuit, their fingers brushing momentarily. And you don't do those things. For the first time, Marshal Reed smiled fully, transforming his stern countenance into something altogether more approachable. Only on Sundays, Miss Everett. She laughed despite herself, feeling some of the tension of the journey melting away. I shall endeavor to stay indoors on the Sabbath, then? That would be wise, he agreed, eyes twinkling. Though you'd miss the best sermons Reverend Thomas has to offer. The journey resumed after their brief respite, but something had changed. Catherine found herself looking forward to their arrival in Willow Springs with anticipation rather than trepidation. Marshal Reed rode ahead now, occasionally glancing back at the stagecoach as though ensuring all was well. By the time they arrived in town, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in hues of crimson and gold. Willow Springs was larger than Catherine had expected. A proper main street lined with wooden buildings, several side streets with modest homes, and even a white-steepled church standing proudly at the end of town. The stagecoach pulled to a stop outside a building marked General Store and Post Office. A small crowd had gathered, eager for news and mail from the outside world. Catherine watched as Marshal Reed spoke briefly with a portly man in apron, presumably the store owner, before approaching the coach once more. Miss Everett, he said, offering his hand again. Welcome to Willow Springs. Mrs. Jenkins is here to escort you to your lodgings. A pleasant-looking woman in her 40s stepped forward, beaming. Miss Everett, we're so pleased you've arrived safely. I'm Martha Jenkins, head of the school board. Catherine shook her hand warmly. Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm eager to begin my duties. First, you must rest from your journey, Mrs. Jenkins insisted. My husband has brought your trunks to the boarding house already. Miss Tolliver runs a respectable establishment for single ladies and has prepared her finest room for you. Catherine turned to the marshal. Thank you for ensuring our safe passage, Marshal Reed. I hope we shall meet again under less urgent circumstances. He touched the brim of his hat. I have no doubt of it, Miss Everett. Willow Springs isn't large enough for any two people to avoid each other for long. There was something in his voice, a note of promise, perhaps that sent a flutter through her stomach. Catherine's room at Miss Tolliver's boarding house was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small writing desk beneath the window. From this vantage point, she could see down the main street to the marshal's office, where a lamp burned late into the evening. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Catherine prepared for the school term. The schoolhouse, a sturdy building with rows of wooden desks and a large slate board, had been neglected during the months without a teacher. She threw herself into cleaning and organizing with enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction from homesickness. On her third afternoon, as she stood on a chair attempting to hang a map of the United States, the schoolhouse door opened. Marshal Reed stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. Miss Everett, he greeted her, crossing the room quickly when he saw her precarious position. Allow me to assist you before you injure yourself. Catherine might have protested that she was perfectly capable, but the truth was the map was unwieldy, and her arms were beginning to ache. Thank you, Marshal. If you could hold the corner there, yes, that's perfect. Together they secured the map, their hands working in tandem. When the task was complete, Catherine stepped down from the chair, suddenly aware of how close they stood. I see you're transforming this place, he observed, glancing around at the freshly cleaned windows and the books she had arranged on shelves. There's much still to do, she admitted, but it will be ready for the children on Monday. I have no doubt. He hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Miss Everett, I wondered if you might permit me to escort you to the town social on Saturday evening. As a newcomer, you might appreciate an introduction to the community." Catherine felt her pulse quicken. "That would be most kind, Marshal Reed." "Jackson," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "When I'm not wearing this badge, I'm just Jackson." "Then I should be Catherine," she replied, feeling a small thrill at the informality. He smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. "Catherine." Her name on his lips sounded different somehow, special. "I'll call for you at Miss Tolliver's at 7 o'clock. After he left, Catherine found herself unable to focus on her tasks, her mind continuously circling back to the way he had said her name, the quiet strength of his presence. Saturday arrived with agonizing slowness. Catherine spent more time than usual on her appearance, selecting a gown of deep blue that her mother had always said brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. Miss Tolliver helped her arrange her hair, commenting that it was good to see a young woman take pride in her appearance even in this God-forsaken territory. When Jackson arrived, precisely at 7, Catherine felt a flutter of nerves. He had exchanged his usual attire for a clean white shirt and dark jacket, though he still wore his gun belt, a concession, she supposed, to his position as marshal. "You look lovely," he said simply, the admiration in his eyes more eloquent than flowery compliments. The town hall was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, tables laden with food prepared by the women of Willow Springs. A small band played in the corner, and couples already moved across the wooden floor in time to the music. Jackson introduced Catherine to what seemed like every resident of the town, ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, the town doctor and countless children who would soon be her pupils. She found herself welcomed with genuine warmth, though she noticed several young women eyeing her escort with undisguised interest. "Marshal Reed is quite popular," she observed as they stepped outside for a breath of air. He leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the darkened town. "The badge is, not necessarily the man wearing it." "I find that hard to believe," Catherine said, moving to stand beside him. "The women inside would suggest otherwise." Jackson glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his expression. "Are you fishing for information, Miss Everett?" "Catherine," she reminded him. "And perhaps I am. It seems prudent to know something about the man escorting me." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough. No, I'm not promised to any of the ladies in there. My position makes some uncomfortable. A marshal makes enemies, and not every woman wants to wonder if her husband will come home each night." The candid admission touched Catherine deeply. "That must be lonely." "It can be," he acknowledged, "but necessary work often is." Inside, the band struck up a waltz. Jackson turned to her, extending his hand. "Would you care to dance, Catherine?" She placed her hand in his, feeling the now familiar warmth of his touch. "I would like that very much." On the dance floor, she discovered another surprise. Marshal Jackson Reed moved with unexpected grace, guiding her confidently through the steps of the waltz. His hand at her waist was respectful but firm, his eyes never leaving hers. "You dance beautifully," she said, somewhat breathlessly. "Another hidden talent?" "My mother's insistence," he replied. "She believed every gentleman should know how to dance, even in the territories." "She was right," Catherine said, allowing herself to enjoy the closeness the dance permitted. As the weeks passed, Catherine settled into life in Willow Springs. Her pupils, ranging from 6-year-olds learning their letters to teenagers studying algebra, proved eager to learn. She found herself increasingly involved in town activities, joining the Ladies' Aid Society and helping at the church. And there was Jackson. He made no secret of his admiration, calling at the boarding house to escort her on walks through town, bringing her wildflowers he had gathered on his patrols, joining her for Sunday dinner at the Jenkins home. Yet there remained a reserve about him, a part of himself he kept hidden. Catherine sensed it in the moments when his gaze would drift to the distant hills, or when conversation touched on his experiences during the war. The turning point came unexpectedly. On a crisp Saturday in early October, Catherine had taken her pupils on a nature expedition to collect specimens for science lessons. They were returning to town when she heard the pounding of hooves. Jackson rode toward them at breakneck speed, his expression grim. He reined in his horse sharply, the animal dancing sideways in protest. "Catherine, get the children back to town. Now." His voice brooked no argument. "What's happened?" she asked, already gathering her pupils closer. "Bank robbery in progress. 3 armed men." His eyes met hers, intense and focused. "Please, get them to safety." Without another word, he spurred his horse toward the town center. Catherine wasted no time, organizing the older children to help the younger ones as they hurried back to town. She delivered them to the church, where Reverend Thomas promised to keep them inside until their parents came. Against all good sense, Catherine found herself moving toward the commotion on Main Street. She told herself she merely wanted information, but the truth was far simpler and more terrifying. She needed to know Jackson was safe. She arrived in time to see Jackson confronting 2 men outside the bank. A third lay on the ground, clutching his leg. The robbers had guns drawn, but so did Jackson, his stance calm but alert. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence that had fallen over the street. "You're outnumbered, Marshal," one of the men snarled. "Look around," Jackson replied steadily. "You really think so?" Catherine saw then what the robbers had missed in their focus on Jackson. Townsmen positioned at windows and doorways, rifles and shotguns at the ready. This wasn't just Jackson enforcing the law, it was the entire community standing together. Perhaps the robbers saw it too. After a moment of hesitation, they lowered their guns. "Wise decision," Jackson said, moving forward to collect their weapons. The danger passed quickly after that. The robbers were secured in the jail, the wounded man treated by the town doctor, and the stolen money returned to the bank. Catherine waited outside the marshal's office, her heart still racing from the events she had witnessed. When Jackson emerged, he stopped short at the sight of her. "Catherine, you should be at the boarding house." "I needed to know you were unharmed," she said simply. Something in his expression softened. "Walk with me?" They strolled in silence to the edge of town, where a small creek provided water for the settlement. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grassy bank where they sat. "What you saw today," Jackson began, "that's the reality of my life. The violence, the danger, it's never far away." Catherine studied his profile, the strong jaw now tense with emotion. "I understand that." "Do you?" He turned to face her fully. "Because I've come to care for you, Catherine. More than I should allow myself to. And I need you to understand what that means, loving a man who wears this badge." The word loving hung between them, momentous and fragile. Catherine reached for his hand, entwining her fingers with his. "I've never been one to choose the easy path, Jackson. When I left Boston, my father warned me that I was trading comfort for hardship. But what I've found here, purpose, community," she paused, gathering her courage, "and you, that's worth any risk." He lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I can't promise you comfort or ease, Catherine, but I can promise you this, I will never take risks I don't need to. I have too much to live for now." The admission, simple and profound, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "That's all I can ask." As the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, Jackson Reed drew Catherine Everett into his arms for the first time. His kiss was gentle yet firm, a promise and a question all at once. She answered with her own embrace, knowing that while life in Willow Springs would never be without challenges, she had found where she belonged, in this rugged land, in this community, and most of all, in the arms of a man whose strength was matched only by his integrity. In the months that followed, their courtship blossomed under the watchful eyes of the town. Jackson proved himself a man of unexpected depths. He helped Catherine establish a small library for the school, revealed a talent for carpentry by crafting bookshelves for her classroom, and demonstrated endless patience with her most difficult pupils when he visited to speak about law and government. By spring, when the hills around Willow Springs erupted in a riot of wildflowers, Jackson proposed marriage on the very spot where they had first acknowledged their feelings. The ring he offered was a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had crossed the plains in a covered wagon and helped establish the first settlement in the region. "She was strong like you," he told Catherine as he slipped it onto her finger. "She would have approved." Their wedding in the white-steepled church united not just 2 people, but seemed to celebrate the spirit of the community itself. The schoolchildren sang, Widow Cooper provided a feast that would be talked about for years to come, and even Catherine's father made the journey from Boston, arriving with a newfound respect for the daughter who had forged her own path. As Catherine and Jackson stood on the porch of the small house they would now share, watching lanterns glow across the town that had become her home, she reflected on the journey that had brought her west. "Any regrets?" Jackson asked, his arm around her waist. Catherine looked up at him. This complex man who had shown her that strength could coexist with tenderness, that duty and love need not be opposing forces. "Not one," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss her husband as the stars began to appear in the vast western sky.